Chapter 21. Influencing by Narration. The art of narration is the art of writing in hooks and eyes. The principle consists in making the appropriate thought follow the appropriate thought, the proper fact, in first preparing the mind for what is to come, and then letting it come. Walter Bagehot, Literary Studies. Our very speech is curiously historical. Most men, you may observe, speak only to narrate, not in imparting what they have thought, which indeed were often a very small matter, but in exhibiting what they have undergone or seen, which is a quite unlimited one. Do talkers dilate? Cut us off from narrative, how would the stream of conversation, even among the wisest, languish into detached handfuls, and among the foolish utterly evaporate? Thus, as we do nothing but enact history, we say little but recite it. Thomas Carlyle, On History. Only a small segment of the great field of narration offers its resources to the public speaker, and that includes the anecdote, biographical facts, and the narration of events in general. Narration, more easily defined than mastered, is the recital of an incident, or a group of facts and occurrences, in such a manner as to produce a desired effect. The laws of narration are few, but its successful practice involves more of art than would at first appear, so much, indeed, that we cannot even touch upon its technique here, but must content ourselves with an examination of a few examples of narration as used in public speech. In a preliminary way, notice how radically the public speaker's use of narrative differs from that of the storywriter in the more limited scope, absence of extended dialogue and character drawing, and freedom from elaboration of detail, which characterize platform narrative. On the other hand, there are several similarities of method, the frequent combination of narration with exposition, description, argumentation, and pleading, the care exercised in the arrangement of material so as to produce a strong effect at the close, climax, the very general practice of concealing the point, denouement, of a story until the effective moment, and the careful suppression of needless, and therefore hurtful, details. So we see that, whether for magazine or platform, the art of narration involves far more than the recital of annals. The succession of events recorded requires a plan in order to bring them out with real effect. It will be noticed, too, that the literary style in platform narration is likely to be either less polished and more vigorously dramatic than in that intended for publication, or else more fervid and elevated in tone. In this latter respect, however, the best platform speaking of today differs from the models of the preceding generation, wherein a highly dignified, and sometimes pompous, style was thought the only fitting dress for a public deliverance. Great, noble and stirring as these older masters were in their lofty and impassioned eloquence, we are sometimes oppressed when we read their sounding periods for any great length of time, even allowing for all that we lose by missing the speaker's presence, voice, and fire. So let us model our platform narration, as our other forms of speech, upon the effective addresses of the moderns, without lessening our admiration for the older school. The anecdote. An anecdote is a short narrative of a single event, told as being striking enough to bring out a point. The keener the point, the more condensed the form, and the more suddenly the application strikes the hearer, the better the story. To regard an anecdote as an illustration, an interpretive picture, will help to hold us to its true purpose, for a purposeless story is of all offenses on the platform the most asinine. A perfectly capital joke will fall flat when it is dragged in by the nape without evident bearing on the subject under discussion. On the other hand, an apposite anecdote has saved many a speech from failure. There is no finer opportunity for the display of tact than in the introduction of witty or humorous stories into a discourse. Wit is keen and like a rapier, piercing deeply, sometimes even to the heart. Humor is good-natured, and does not wound. Wit is founded upon the sudden discovery of an unsuspected relation existing between two ideas. Humor deals with things out of relation, with the incongruous. It was wit in Douglas Jerrold to retort upon the scowl of a stranger whose shoulder he had familiarly slapped, mistaking him for a friend, "I beg your pardon, I thought I knew you, but I'm glad I don't." It was humor in the Southern orator, John Wise, to liken the pleasure of spending an evening with a Puritan girl to that of sitting on a block of ice in winter, cracking hailstones between his teeth. 24. The foregoing quotation has been introduced chiefly to illustrate the first and simplest form of anecdote, the single sentence embodying a pungent saying. Another simple form is that which conveys its meaning without need of application, as the old preachers used to say. George Ade has quoted this one as the best joke he ever heard. Two solemn-looking gentlemen were riding together in a railway carriage. One gentleman said to the other, "Is your wife entertaining this summer?" Whereupon the other gentleman replied, "Not very." Other anecdotes need harnessing to the particular truth the speaker wishes to carry along in his talk. Sometimes the application is made before the story is told and the audience is prepared to make the comparison, point by point, as the illustration is told. Henry W. Grady used this method in one of the anecdotes he told while delivering his great extemporaneous address, The New South. Age does not endow all things with strength and virtue, nor are all new things to be despised. The shoemaker who put over his door, John Smith's shop, founded 1760, was more than matched by his young rival across the street who hung out this sign, Bill Jones. Established 1886. No old stock kept in this shop. In two anecdotes, told also in The New South, Mr. Grady illustrated another way of enforcing the application. In both instances he split the idea he wished to drive home, bringing in part before and part after the recital of the story. The fact that the speaker misquoted the words of Genesis in which the ark is described did not seem to detract from the burlesque humor of the story. I bespeak the utmost stretch of your courtesy tonight. I am not troubled about those from whom I come. You remember the man whose wife sent him to a neighbor with a pitcher of milk, who, tripping on the top step, fell, with such casual interruptions as the landings afforded, into the basement, and, while picking himself up, had the pleasure of hearing his wife call out, "John, did you break the pitcher?" "No, I didn't," said John, "but I be dinged if I don't." So, while those who call to me from behind may inspire me with energy, if not with courage, I ask an indulgent hearing from you. I beg that you will bring your full faith in American fairness and frankness to judgment upon what I shall say. There was an old preacher once who told some boys of the Bible lesson he was going to read in the morning. The boys, finding the place, glued together the connecting pages. The next morning he read on the bottom of one page, "When Noah was 120 years old he took unto himself a wife, who was," then turning the page, 140 cubits long, 40 cubits wide, built of gopher wood, and covered with pitch inside and out. He was naturally puzzled at this. He read it again, verified it, and then said, "My friends, this is the first time I ever met this in the Bible, but I accept it as an evidence of the assertion that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. If I could get you to hold such faith tonight, I could proceed cheerfully to the task I otherwise approach with a sense of consecration." Now and then a speaker will plunge without introduction into an anecdote, leaving the application to follow. The following illustrates this method. A large, slew-footed darky was leaning against the corner of the railroad station in a Texas town when the noon whistle in the canning factory blew and the hands hurried out, bearing their grub buckets. The darky listened, with his head on one side until the rocketing echo had quite died away. Then he heaved a deep sigh and remarked to himself, "Dar she go. Dinner time for some folks, but just 12 o'clock for me." That is the situation in thousands of American factories, large and small, today. And why? Etc., etc. Doubtless the most frequent platform use of the anecdote is in the pulpit. The sermon illustration, however, is not always strictly narrative in form, but tends to extended comparison, as the following from Dr. Alexander McLaren: "Men will stand as Indian fakirs do, with their arms above their heads until they stiffen there. They will perch themselves upon pillars like simian stylites, for years, till the birds build their nests in their hair. They will measure all the distance from Cape Comorin to Juggernaut's temple with their bodies along the dusty road. They will wear hair shirts and scourge themselves. They will fast and deny themselves. They will build cathedrals and endow churches. They will do as many of you do, labor by fits and starts all through your lives at the endless task of making yourselves ready for heaven, and winning it by obedience and by righteousness. They will do all these things and do them gladly, rather than listen to the humbling message that says, you do not need to do anything, wash. Is it your washing, or the water, that will clean you? Wash and be clean. Naaman's cleaning was only a test of his obedience, and a token that it was God who cleansed him. There was no power in Jordan's waters to take away the taint of leprosy. Our cleansing is in that blood of Jesus Christ that has the power to take away all sin, and to make the foulest amongst us pure and clean. One final word must be said about the introduction to the anecdote. A clumsy, inappropriate introduction is fatal, whereas a single apt or witty sentence will kindle interest and prepare a favorable hearing. The following extreme illustration, by the English humorist, Captain Harry Graham, well satirizes the stumbling manner. The best story that I ever heard was one that I was told once in the fall of 1905, or it may have been 1906, when I was visiting Boston. At least, I think it was Boston. It may have been Washington. My memory is so bad. I happened to run across a most amusing man whose name I forget, Williams or Wilson or Wilkins, some name like that, and he told me this story while we were waiting for a trolley car. I can still remember how heartily I laughed at the time, and again, that evening, after I had gone to bed, how I laughed myself to sleep recalling the humor of this incredibly humorous story. It was really quite extraordinarily funny. In fact, I can truthfully affirm that it is quite the most amusing story I have ever had the privilege of hearing. Unfortunately, I've forgotten it. Biographical facts. Public speaking has much to do with personalities. Naturally, therefore, the narration of a series of biographical details, including anecdotes among the recital of interesting facts, plays a large part in the eulogy, the memorial address, the political speech, the sermon, the lecture, and other platform deliverances. Whole addresses may be made up of such biographical details, such as a sermon on Moses, or a lecture on Lee. The following example is in itself an expanded anecdote, forming a link in a chain. Marius in prison. The peculiar sublimity of the Roman mind does not express itself, nor is it at all to be sought, in their poetry. Poetry, according to the Roman ideal of it, was not an adequate organ for the grander movements of the national mind. Roman sublimity must be looked for in Roman acts, and in Roman sayings. Where, again, will you find a more adequate expression of the Roman majesty, than in the saying of Trajan, Imperatorum oporturis stantem mori, that Caesar ought to die standing, a speech of imperatorial grandeur. Implying that he, who was, the foremost man of all this world, and, in regard to all other nations, the representative of his own, should express its characteristic virtue in his farewell act, should die in procinctu, and should meet the last enemy as the first, with a Roman countenance and in a soldier's attitude. If this had an imperatorial, what follows had a consular majesty, and is almost the grandest story upon record. Marius, the man who rose to be 7 times consul, was in a dungeon, and a slave was sent in with commission to put him to death. These were the persons, the two extremities of exalted and forlorn humanity, its vanward and its rearward man, a Roman consul and an abject slave. But their natural relations to each other were, by the caprice of fortune, monstrously inverted. The consul was in chains, the slave was for a moment the arbiter of his fate. By what spells, what magic, did Marius reinstate himself in his natural prerogatives? By what marvels drawn from heaven or from earth, did he, in the twinkling of an eye, again invest himself with the purple, and place between himself and his assassin a host of shadowy lictors? By the mere blank supremacy of great minds over weak ones. He fascinated the slave, as a rattlesnake does a bird. Standing, like Tenerife, he smote him with his eye, and said, Tune, homo, odes occidir si Mariam? Dost thou, fellow, presume to kill Caius Marius? Whereat, the reptile, quaking under the voice, nor daring to affront the consular, sank gently to the ground, turned round upon his hands and feet, and, crawling out of the prison like any other vermin, left Marius standing in solitude as steadfast and immovable as the Capitol. Thomas de Quincey. Here is a similar example, prefaced by a general historical statement and concluding with autobiographical details, a reminiscence of Lexington one raw morning in spring. It will be 80 years the 19th day of this month. Hancock and Adams, the Moses and Aaron of that great deliverance, were both at Lexington. They also had obstructed an officer, with brave words. British soldiers, 1,000 strong, came to seize them and carry them overseas for trial, and so nipped the bud of freedom auspiciously opening in that early spring. The town militia came together before daylight, for training. A great, tall man, with a large head and a high, wide brow, their captain, one who had seen service, marshaled them into line, numbering but 70, and bade every man load his piece with powder and ball. "I will order the first man shot that runs away," said he, when some faltered. "Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they want to have a war, let it begin here." Gentlemen, you know what followed. Those farmers and mechanics fired the shot heard round the world. A little monument covers the bones of such as before had pledged their fortune and their sacred honor to the freedom of America, and that day gave it also their lives. I was born in that little town, and bred up amid the memories of that day. When a boy, my mother lifted me up, one Sunday, in her religious, patriotic arms, and held me while I read the first monumental line I ever saw, sacred to liberty and the rights of mankind. Since then I have studied the memorial marbles of Greece and Rome, in many an ancient town, nay, on Egyptian obelisks have read what was written before the Eternal raised up Moses to lead Israel out of Egypt, but no chiseled stone has ever stirred me to such emotion as these rustic names of men who fell, in the sacred cause of God and their country. Gentlemen, the spirit of liberty, the love of justice, were early fanned into a flame in my boyish heart. That monument covers the bones of my own kinsfolk. It was their blood which reddened the long, green grass at Lexington. It was my own name which stands chiseled on that stone, the tall captain who marshaled his fellow farmers and mechanics into stern array, and spoke such brave and dangerous words as opened the War of American Independence. The last to leave the field, was my father's father. I learned to read out of his Bible, and with a musket he that day captured from the foe, I learned another religious lesson, that rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. I keep them both, sacred to liberty and the rights of mankind, to use them both, in the sacred cause of God and my country. Theodore Parker. Narration of events in general. In this wider, emancipated narration we find much mingling of other forms of discourse, greatly to the advantage of the speech, for this truth cannot be too strongly emphasized: the efficient speaker cuts loose from form for the sake of a big, free effect. The present analyses are for no other purpose than to acquaint you with form. Do not allow any such models to hang as a weight about your neck. The following pure narration of events, from George William Curtis's Paul Revere's Ride, varies the biographical recital in other parts of his famous oration. That evening, at 10 o'clock, 800 British troops, under Lieutenant Colonel Smith, took boat at the foot of the Common and crossed to the Cambridge shore. Gage thought his secret had been kept, but Lord Percy, who had heard the people say on the Common that the troops would miss their aim, undeceived him. Gage instantly ordered that no one should leave the town. But as the troops crossed the river, Ebenezer Dorr, with a message to Hancock and Adams, was riding over the neck to Roxbury, and Paul Revere was rowing over the river to Charlestown, having agreed with his friend, Robert Newman, to show lanterns from the belfry of the Old North Church, 1 if by land, and 2 if by sea, as a signal of the march of the British. The following, from the same oration, beautifully mingles description with narration. It was a brilliant night. The winter had been unusually mild, and the spring very forward. The hills were already green. The early grain waved in the fields, and the air was sweet with the blossoming orchards. Already the robins whistled, the bluebirds sang, and the benediction of peace rested upon the landscape. Under the cloudless moon the soldiers silently marched, and Paul Revere swiftly rode, galloping through Medford and West Cambridge, rousing every house as he went spurring for Lexington and Hancock and Adams, and evading the British patrols who had been sent out to stop the news. In the succeeding extract from another of Mr. Curtis's addresses, we have a free use of allegory as illustration, the leadership of educated men. There is a modern English picture which the genius of Hawthorne might have inspired. The painter calls it, How They Met Themselves. A man and a woman, haggard and weary, wandering lost in a somber wood, suddenly meet the shadowy figures of a youth and a maid. Some mysterious fascination fixes the gaze and stills the hearts of the wanderers, and their amazement deepens into awe as they gradually recognize themselves as once they were, the soft bloom of youth upon their rounded cheeks, the dewy light of hope in their trusting eyes, exulting confidence in their springing step, themselves blithe and radiant with the glory of the dawn. Today, and here, we meet ourselves. Not to these familiar scenes alone, yonder College Green with its reverend traditions, the halcyon cove of the Seekonk, upon which the memory of Roger Williams broods like a bird of calm, the historic bay, beating forever with the muffled oars of Barton and of Abraham Whipple, here, the humming city of the living, there, the peaceful city of the dead. Not to these only or chiefly do we return, but to ourselves as we once were. It is not the smiling freshmen of the year, it is your own beardless and unwrinkled faces, that are looking from the windows of University Hall and of Hope College. Under the trees upon the hill it is yourselves whom you see walking, full of hopes and dreams, glowing with conscious power, and nourishing a youth sublime, and in this familiar temple, which surely has never echoed with eloquence so fervid and inspiring as that of your commencement orations, it is not yonder youths in the galleries who, as they fondly believe, are whispering to yonder maids, it is your younger selves who, in the days that are no more, are murmuring to the fairest mothers and grandmothers of those maids. Happy the worn and weary man and woman in the picture could they have felt their older eyes still glistening with that earlier light, and their hearts yet beating with undiminished sympathy and aspiration. Happy we, brethren, whatever may have been achieved, whatever left undone, if, returning to the home of our earlier years, we bring with us the illimitable hope, the unchilled resolution, the inextinguishable faith of youth. George William Curtis. Questions and Exercises 1. Clip from any source 10 anecdotes and state what truths they may be used to illustrate. 2. Deliver 5 of these in your own language, without making any application. 3. From the 10, deliver 1 so as to make the application before telling the anecdote. 4. Deliver another so as to split the application. 5. Deliver another so as to make the application after the narration. 6. Deliver another in such a way as to make a specific application needless. 7. Give 3 ways of introducing an anecdote, by saying where you heard it, etc. 8. Deliver an illustration that is not strictly an anecdote, in the style of Curtis's speech on page 259. 9. Deliver an address on any public character, using the forms illustrated in this chapter. 10. Deliver an address on some historical event in the same manner. 11. Explain how the sympathies and viewpoint of the speaker will color an anecdote, a biography, or a historical account. 12. Illustrate how the same anecdote, or a section of a historical address, may be given 2 different effects by personal prejudice. 13. What would be the effect of shifting the viewpoint in the midst of a narration? 14. What is the danger of using too much humor in an address? Too much pathos. Footnotes. 24. How to attract and hold an audience, J. Berg Esenwein. Chapter 22. Influencing by suggestion. Sometimes the feeling that a given way of looking at things is undoubtedly correct prevents the mind from thinking at all. In view of the hindrances which certain kinds or degrees of feeling throw into the way of thinking, it might be inferred that the thinker must suppress the element of feeling in the inner life. No greater mistake could be made. If the Creator endowed man with the power to think, to feel, and to will. These several activities of the mind are not designed to be in conflict, and so long as any one of them is not perverted or allowed to run to excess, it necessarily aids and strengthens the others in their normal functions. Nathan C. Schaeffer, Thinking and Learning to Think. When we weigh, compare, and decide upon the value of any given ideas, we reason. When an idea produces in us an opinion or an action, without first being subjected to deliberation, we are moved by suggestion. Man was formerly thought to be a reasoning animal, basing his actions on the conclusions of natural logic. It was supposed that before forming an opinion or deciding on a course of conduct he weighed at least some of the reasons for and against the matter, and performed a more or less simple process of reasoning. But modern research has shown that quite the opposite is true. Most of our opinions and actions are not based upon conscious reasoning, but are the result of suggestion. In fact, some authorities declare that an act of pure reasoning is very rare in the average mind. Momentous decisions are made, far-reaching actions are determined upon, primarily by the force of suggestion. Notice that word, primarily, for simple thought, and even mature reasoning, often follows a suggestion accepted in the mind, and the thinker fondly supposes that his conclusion is from first to last based on cold logic. The basis of suggestion: we must think of suggestion both as an effect and as a cause. Considered as an effect, or objectively, there must be something in the hearer that predisposes him to receive suggestion. Considered as a cause, or subjectively, there must be some methods by which the speaker can move upon that particularly susceptible attitude of the hearer. How to do this honestly and fairly is our problem. To do it dishonestly and trickily, to use suggestion to bring about conviction and action without a basis of right and truth and in a bad cause, is to assume the terrible responsibility that must fall on the champion of error. Jesus scorned not to use suggestion so that he might move men to their benefit, but every vicious trickster has adopted the same means to reach base ends. Therefore honest men will examine well into their motives and into the truth of their cause, before seeking to influence men by suggestion. 3 fundamental conditions make us all susceptible to suggestion. We naturally respect authority. In every mind this is only a question of degree, ranging from the subject who is easily hypnotized to the stubborn mind that fortifies itself the more strongly with every assault upon its opinion. The latter type is almost immune to suggestion. One of the singular things about suggestion is that it is rarely a fixed quantity. The mind that is receptive to the authority of a certain person may prove inflexible to another. Moods and environments that produce hypnosis readily in one instance may be entirely inoperative in another, and some minds can scarcely ever be thus moved. We do know, however, that the feeling of the subject that authority, influence, power, domination, control, whatever you wish to call it, lies in the person of the suggester, is the basis of all suggestion. The extreme force of this influence is demonstrated in hypnotism. The hypnotic subject is told that he is in the water, he accepts the statement as true and makes swimming motions. He is told that a band is marching down the street, playing the Star-Spangled Banner, he declares he hears the music, arises and stands with head bared. In the same way some speakers are able to achieve a modified hypnotic effect upon their audiences. The hearers will applaud measures and ideas which, after individual reflection, they will repudiate unless such reflection brings the conviction that the first impression is correct. A second important principle is that our feelings, thoughts and wills tend to follow the line of least resistance. Once open the mind to the sway of one feeling and it requires a greater power of feeling, thought, or will, or even all 3, to unseat it. Our feelings influence our judgments and volitions much more than we care to admit. So true is this that it is a superhuman task to get an audience to reason fairly on a subject on which it feels deeply, and when this result is accomplished the success becomes noteworthy, as in the case of Henry Ward Beecher's Liverpool speech. Emotional ideas once accepted are soon cherished, and finally become our very inmost selves. Attitudes based on feelings alone are prejudices. What is true of our feelings, in this respect, applies to our ideas. all thoughts that enter the mind tend to be accepted as truth unless a stronger and contradictory thought arises. The speaker skilled in moving men to action manages to dominate the minds of his audience with his thoughts by subtly prohibiting the entertaining of ideas hostile to his own. Most of us are captured by the latest strong attack, and if we can be induced to act while under the stress of that last insistent thought, we lose sight of counter-influences. The fact is that almost all our decisions, if they involve thought at all, are of this sort. At the moment of decision the course of action then under contemplation usurps the attention, and conflicting ideas are dropped out of consideration. The head of a large publishing house remarked only recently that 90% of the people who bought books by subscription never read them. They buy because the salesman presents his wares so skillfully that every consideration but the attractiveness of the book drops out of the mind, and that thought prompts action. Every idea that enters the mind will result in action unless a contradictory thought arises to prohibit it. Think of singing the musical scale and it will result in your singing it unless the counter-thought of its futility or absurdity inhibits your action. If you bandage and doctor a horse's foot, he will go lame. You cannot think of swallowing, without the muscles used in that process being affected. You cannot think of saying, hello, without a slight movement of the muscles of speech. To warn children that they should not put beans up their noses is the surest method of getting them to do it. Every thought called up in the mind of your audience will work either for or against you. Thoughts are not dead matter, they radiate dynamic energy, the thoughts all tend to pass into action. Thought is another name for fate. Dominate your hearers' thoughts, allay all contradictory ideas, and you will sway them as you wish. Volitions as well as feelings and thoughts tend to follow the line of least resistance. That is what makes habit. Suggest to a man that it is impossible to change his mind, and in most cases it becomes more difficult to do so. The exception is the man who naturally jumps to the contrary. Counter-suggestion is the only way to reach him. Suggest subtly and persistently that the opinions of those in the audience who are opposed to your views are changing, and it requires an effort of the will, in fact, a summoning of the forces of feeling, thought and will, to stem the tide of change that has subconsciously set in. But, not only are we moved by authority, and tend toward channels of least resistance, we are all influenced by our environments. It is difficult to rise above the sway of a crowd, its enthusiasms and its fears are contagious because they are suggestive. What so many feel, we say to ourselves, must have some basis in truth. 10 times 10 makes more than 100. Set 10 men to speaking to 10 audiences of 10 men each, and compare the aggregate power of those 10 speakers with that of one man addressing 100 men. The 10 speakers may be more logically convincing than the single orator, but the chances are strongly in favor of the one man's reaching a greater total effect, for the 100 men will radiate conviction and resolution as 10 small groups could not. We all know the truism about the enthusiasm of numbers. See the chapter on influencing the crowd. Environment controls us unless the contrary is strongly suggested. A gloomy day, in a drab room, sparsely tenanted by listeners, invites platform disaster. Everyone feels it in the air. But let the speaker walk squarely up to the issue and suggest by all his feeling, manner and words that this is going to be a great gathering in every vital sense, and see how the suggestive power of environment recedes before the advance of a more potent suggestion, if such the speaker is able to make it. Now these three factors, respect for authority, tendency to follow lines of least resistance, and susceptibility to environment, all help to bring the auditor into a state of mind favorable to suggestive influences, but they also react on the speaker, and now we must consider those personally causative, or subjective, forces which enable him to use suggestion effectively. How the speaker can make suggestion effective. We have seen that under the influence of authoritative suggestion the audience is inclined to accept the speaker's assertion without argument and criticism. But the audience is not in this state of mind unless it has implicit confidence in the speaker. If they lack faith in him, question his motives or knowledge, or even object to his manner, they will not be moved by his most logical conclusion and will fail to give him a just hearing. It is all a matter of their confidence in him. Whether the speaker finds it already in the warm, expectant look of his hearers, or must win to it against opposition or coldness, he must gain that one great vantage point before his suggestions take on power in the hearts of his listeners. Confidence is the mother of conviction. Note in the opening of Henry W. Grady's after-dinner speech how he attempted to secure the confidence of his audience. He created a receptive atmosphere by a humorous story, expressed his desire to speak with earnestness and sincerity, acknowledged the vast interests involved, deprecated his untried arm, and professed his humility. Would not such an introduction give you confidence in the speaker, unless you were strongly opposed to him? And even then, would it not partly disarm your antagonism? Mr. President, bidden by your invitation to a discussion of the race problem, forbidden by occasion to make a political speech, I appreciate, in trying to reconcile orders with propriety, the perplexity of the little maid, who, bidden to learn to swim, was yet adjured, "Now, go, my darling, hang your clothes on a hickory limb, and don't go near the water." The stoutest apostle of the Church, they say, is the missionary, and the missionary, wherever he unfurls his flag, will never find himself in deeper need of unction and address than I, bidden tonight to plant the standard of a Southern Democrat in Boston's banquet hall, and to discuss the problem of the races in the home of Phillips and of Sumner. But, Mr. President, if a purpose to speak in perfect frankness and sincerity, if earnest understanding of the vast interests involved, if a consecrating sense of what disaster may follow further misunderstanding and estrangement, if these may be counted to steady undisciplined speech and to strengthen an untried arm, then, sir, I shall find the courage to proceed. Note also Mr. Bryan's attempt to secure the confidence of his audience in the following introduction to his Cross of Gold speech delivered before the National Democratic Convention in Chicago, 1896. He asserts his own inability to oppose the distinguished gentleman, he maintains the holiness of his cause, and he declares that he will speak in the interest of humanity, well knowing that humanity is likely to have confidence in the champion of their rights. This introduction completely dominated the audience, and the speech made Mr. Bryan famous. Mr. Chairman and gentlemen of the convention, I would be presumptuous indeed to present myself against the distinguished gentleman to whom you have listened if this were a mere measuring of abilities, but this is not a contest between persons. The humblest citizen in all the land, when clad in the armor of a righteous cause, is stronger than all the hosts of error. I come to speak to you in defense of a cause as holy as the cause of liberty, the cause of humanity. Some speakers are able to beget confidence by their very manner, while others cannot. To secure confidence, be confident. How can you expect others to accept a message in which you lack, or seem to lack, faith yourself? Confidence is as contagious as disease. Napoleon rebuked an officer for using the word impossible in his presence. The speaker who will entertain no idea of defeat begets in his hearers the idea of his victory. Lady Macbeth was so confident of success that Macbeth changed his mind about undertaking the assassination. Columbus was so certain in his mission that Queen Isabella pawned her jewels to finance his expedition. Assert your message with implicit assurance, and your own belief will act as so much gunpowder to drive it home. Advertisers have long utilized this principle. The machine you will eventually buy, ask the man who owns one, has the strength of Gibraltar, are publicity slogans so full of confidence that they give birth to confidence in the mind of the reader. It should, but may not, go without saying that confidence must have a solid ground of merit or there will be a ridiculous crash. It is all very well for the spellbinder to claim all the precincts, the official count is just ahead. The reaction against overconfidence and oversuggestion ought to warn those whose chief asset is mere bluff. A short time ago a speaker arose in a public speaking club and asserted that grass would spring from wood ashes sprinkled over the soil, without the aid of seed. This idea was greeted with a laugh, but the speaker was so sure of his position that he reiterated the statement forcefully several times and cited his own personal experience as proof. One of the most intelligent men in the audience, who at first had derided the idea, at length came to believe in it. When asked the reason for his sudden change of attitude, he replied, "Because the speaker is so confident." In fact, he was so confident that it took a letter from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to dislodge his error. If by a speaker's confidence, intelligent men can be made to believe such preposterous theories as this, where will the power of self-reliance cease when plausible propositions are under consideration, advanced with all the power of convincing speech? Note the utter assurance in these selections, "I know not what course others may take, but as for me give me liberty or give me death." Patrick Henry. "I ne'er will ask ye quarter, and I ne'er will be your slave, but I'll swim the sea of slaughter, till I sink beneath its wave." Patton. "Come one, come all. This rock shall fly from its firm base as soon as I, Sir Walter Scott Invictus out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance I have not winced nor cried aloud, under the bludgeonings of chance my head is bloody, but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll, I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul." William Ernest Henley. Authority is a factor in suggestion. We generally accept as truth, and without criticism, the words of an authority. When he speaks, contradictory ideas rarely arise in the mind to inhibit the action he suggests. A judge of the Supreme Court has the power of his words multiplied by the virtue of his position. The ideas of the U.S. Commissioner of Immigration on his subject are much more effective and powerful than those of a soap manufacturer, though the latter may be an able economist. This principle also has been used in advertising. We are told that the physicians to two kings have recommended Synatogen. We are informed that the largest bank in America, Tiffany & Company, and the State, War, and Navy departments, all use the Encyclopaedia Britannica. The shrewd promoter gives stock in his company to influential bankers or businessmen in the community in order that he may use their examples as a selling argument. If you wish to influence your audience through suggestion, if you would have your statements accepted without criticism or argument, you should appear in the light of an authority, and be one. Ignorance and credulity will remain unchanged unless the suggestion of authority be followed promptly by facts. Don't claim authority unless you carry your license in your pocket. Let reason support the position that suggestion has assumed. Advertising will help to establish your reputation. It is up to you to maintain it. One speaker found that his reputation as a magazine writer was a splendid asset as a speaker. Mr. Bryan's publicity, gained by 3 nominations for the presidency and his position as Secretary of State, helps him to command large sums as a speaker. But, back of it all, he is a great speaker. Newspaper announcements, all kinds of advertising, formality, impressive introductions, all have a capital effect on the attitude of the audience. But how ridiculous are all these if a toy pistol is advertised as a 16-inch gun? Note how authority is used in the following to support the strength of the speaker's appeal. Professor Alfred Russel Wallace has just celebrated his 90th birthday. Sharing with Charles Darwin the honor of discovering evolution, Professor Wallace has lately received many insignal honors from scientific societies. At the dinner given him in London, his address was largely made up of reminiscences. He reviewed the progress of civilization during the last century and made a series of brilliant and startling contrasts between the England of 1813 and the world of 1913. He affirmed that our progress is only seeming and not real. Professor Wallace insists that the painters, the sculptors, the architects of Athens and Rome were so superior to the modern men that the very fragments of their marbles and temples are the despair of the present-day artists. He tells us that man has improved his telescope and spectacles, but that he is losing his eyesight, that man is improving his looms, but stiffening his fingers, improving his automobile and his locomotive, but losing his legs, improving his foods, but losing his digestion. He adds that the modern white slave traffic, orphan asylums, and tenement house life in factory towns make a black page in the history of the 20th century. Professor Wallace's views are reinforced by the report of the Commission of Parliament on the causes of the deterioration of the factory-class people. In our own country, Professor Jordan warns us against war, intemperance, overworking, underfeeding of poor children, and disturbs our contentment with his harvest of blood. Professor Jenks is more pessimistic. He thinks that the pace, the climate, and the stress of city life have broken down the Puritan stock, that in another century our old families will be extinct, and that the flood of immigration means a Niagara of muddy waters fouling the pure springs of American life. In his address in New Haven, Professor Kellogg calls the role of the signs of race degeneracy and tells us that this deterioration even indicates a trend toward race extinction. Newell Dwight Hillis. From every side come warnings to the American people. Our medical journals are filled with danger signals. New books and magazines, fresh from the press, tell us plainly that our people are fronting a social crisis. Mr. Jefferson, who was once regarded as good democratic authority, seems to have differed in opinion from the gentleman who has addressed us on the part of the minority. Those who are opposed to this proposition tell us that the issue of paper money is a function of the bank, and that the government ought to go out of the banking business. I stand with Jefferson rather than with them, and tell them, as he did, that the issue of money is a function of government, and that the banks ought to go out of the governing business. William Jennings Bryan. Authority is the great weapon against doubt, but even its force can rarely prevail against prejudice and persistent wrong-headedness. If any speaker has been able to forge a sword that is warranted to piece such armor, let him bless humanity by sharing his secret with his platform brethren everywhere, for thus far he is alone in his glory. There is a middle ground between the suggestion of authority and the confession of weakness that offers a wide range for tact in the speaker. No one can advise you when to throw your hat in the ring and say defiantly at the outstart, "Gentlemen, I am here to fight." Theodore Roosevelt can do that. Beecher would have been mobbed if he had begun in that style at Liverpool. It is for your own tact to decide whether you will use the disarming grace of Henry W. Grady's introduction just quoted. Even the time-worn joke was ingenuous and seemed to say, "Gentlemen, I come to you with no carefully palmed coins," or whether the solemn gravity of Mr. Bryan before the convention will prove to be more effective. Only be sure that your opening attitude is well thought out, and if it change as you warm up to your subject, let not the change lay you open to a revulsion of feeling in your audience. Example is a powerful means of suggestion. As we saw while thinking of environment in its effects on an audience, we do, without the usual amount of hesitation and criticism, what others are doing. Paris wears certain hats and gowns, the rest of the world imitates. The child mimics the actions, accents, and intonations of the parent. Were a child never to hear anyone speak, he would never acquire the power of speech, unless under most arduous training, and even then only imperfectly. One of the biggest department stores in the United States spends fortunes on one advertising slogan, "Everybody is going to the big store." That makes everybody want to go. You can reinforce the power of your message by showing that it has been widely accepted. Political organizations subsidize applause to create the impression that their speakers' ideas are warmly received and approved by the audience. The advocates of the commission form of government of cities, the champions of votes for women, reserve as their strongest arguments the fact that a number of cities and states have already successfully accepted their plans. Advertisements use the testimonial for its power of suggestion. Observe how this principle has been applied in the following selections, and utilize it on every occasion possible in your attempts to influence through suggestion. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand ye here idle? Patrick Henry. With a zeal approaching the zeal which inspired the Crusaders who followed Peter the Hermit, our silver Democrats went forth from victory unto victory until they are now assembled, not to discuss, not to debate, but to enter up the judgment already rendered by the plain people of this country. In this contest brother has been arrayed against brother, father against son. The warmest ties of love, acquaintance, and association have been disregarded, old leaders have been cast aside when they refuse to give expression to the sentiments of those whom they would lead, and new leaders have sprung up to give direction to this cause of truth. Thus has the contest been waged, and we have assembled here under as binding and solemn instructions as were ever imposed upon representatives of the people. William Jennings Bryan. Figurative and indirect language has suggestive force, because it does not make statements that can be directly disputed. It arouses no contradictory ideas in the minds of the audience, thereby fulfilling one of the basic requisites of suggestion. By implying a conclusion in indirect or figurative language, it is often asserted most forcefully. Note that in the following Mr. Bryan did not say that Mr. McKinley would be defeated. He implied it in a much more effective manner. Mr. McKinley was nominated at St. Louis upon a platform which declared for the maintenance of the gold standard until it can be changed into bimetallism by international agreement. Mr. McKinley was the most popular man among the Republicans, and 3 months ago everybody in the Republican Party prophesied his election. How is it today? Why, the man who was once pleased to think that he looked like Napoleon, that man shudders today when he remembers that he was nominated on the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. Not only that, but as he listens he can hear with ever-increasing distinctness the sound of the waves as they beat upon the lonely shores of St. Helena. Had Thomas Carlyle said, "A false man cannot found a religion," his words would have been neither so suggestive nor so powerful, nor so long remembered as his implication in these striking words, "A false man found a religion?" Why, a false man cannot build a brick house. If he does not know and follow truly the properties of mortar, burnt clay, and what else he works in, it is no house that he makes, but a rubbish heap. It will not stand for 12 centuries, to lodge 180 millions, it will fall straightway. A man must conform himself to nature's laws, be verily in communion with nature and the truth of things, or nature will answer him, "No, not at all." Observe how the picture that Webster draws here is much more emphatic and forceful than any mere assertion could be. "Sir, I know not how others may feel, but as for myself, when I see my alma mater surrounded, like Caesar in the Senate House, by those who are reiterating stab after stab, I would not for this right hand have her turn to me and say, 'And thou, too, my son.'" Webster. A speech should be built on sound logical foundations, and no man should dare to speak in behalf of a fallacy. Arguing a subject, however, will necessarily arouse contradictory ideas in the mind of your audience. When immediate action or persuasion is desired, suggestion is more efficacious than argument. When both are judiciously mixed, the effect is irresistible. Questions and exercises. 1. Make an outline, or brief, of the contents of this chapter. 2. Revise the introduction to any of your written addresses, with the teachings of this chapter in mind. 3. Give 2 original examples of the power of suggestion as you have observed it in each of these fields. A. Advertising. B. Politics. C. Public sentiment. 4. Give original examples of suggestive speech, illustrating 2 of the principles set forth in this chapter. 5. What reasons can you give that disprove the general contention of this chapter? 6. What reasons not already given seem to you to support it? 7. What effect do his own suggestions have on the speaker himself? 8. Can suggestion arise from the audience? If so, show how. 9. Select 2 instances of suggestion in the speeches found in the appendix. 10. Change any 2 passages in the same, or other, speeches so as to use suggestion more effectively. 11. Deliver those passages in the revised form. 12. Choosing your own subject, prepare and deliver a short speech largely in the suggestive style.